Chapter 11, the Jackson Era, Section 1, Jacksonian Democracy. So we start off here discussing and reviewing over the election of 1824, and it being a unique election in American history in which we have four viable good candidates. Actually, it started out with five, but John C. Calhoun kind of dropped out. So what I had asked you to do here is to basically put the names of the various candidates as we go through. So let's start off here and discuss why this election was so important. So in 1824, this is the first time that we have basically the second generation of Americans running for office. The last of the Virginia dynasty of James Monroe has basically served his 2 terms and is stepping down. And so now we have various other individuals running for the office of president. So in the election of 1824, we have Andrew Jackson from Tennessee. He is very popular. His background, of course, is as the savior of the city of New Orleans, a hero from the War of 1812. He is from a hard background life, meaning he was born poor in South Carolina. He then moves into Tennessee. He's pretty much a self-taught, self-made man. We then have the opposite, and that is John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts. Now, John Quincy Adams, of course, is son of the former president, second president of the United States. John Quincy Adams had served with him as a young teenager overseas, and so he is a very experienced American diplomat. He had helped with the Treaty of Ghent to end the War of 1812. He was Secretary of State under James Monroe, so he's got a lot of experience as well. Then you have Henry Clay. Henry Clay, of course, Kentucky, a Westerner, the man who is very much a person who settles disputes through compromise. He is Speaker of the House, and so he is also running. So all these men are all running under the Democratic Republican Party at the time. And last but not least is William Crawford. Now, you would not recognize him, but people at the time very much did. He was Secretary of the Treasury. He was from the southern states. He had basically been a congressman. So these are your 4 candidates for president. So since you have 4 viable candidates, what happens in the election is that actually no candidate got a majority of electoral votes. Jackson got the most electoral and the most popular votes, but this is known as a plurality. It's the biggest share, but not yet the amount necessary to win the presidency. And so in your book, we'll look at this later and talk about what he actually was able to achieve. As we go to the next slide, you'll see it in bar graph fashion. You can see obviously Jackson has the most, but he doesn't have the necessary amount to win the presidency. So if you look in your book, or just look here, you can sort of see some important information here. And so what that important information is showing, the electoral totals. And so what we need to figure out is we add all these together to get a total. And then once we get that total, we are able to figure out what the necessary number is to win the presidency. So at the time, there were 261 electoral votes possible. So as we discussed here in class, what we talked about was what's the number necessary for a simple majority? Well, simple majority is 1 more than half. So if you add these all together, you get 261. The winning amount would be 132. So you can sort of see Jackson misses it by quite a large margin. And just to look and see what that margin would be if you turned it into like a percentage, you divide those 2 numbers together and he got 38% of the electoral vote. So that's his percentage, 38%. So you can see he missed it by a pretty large amount. So what has to happen now? Okay. So what has to happen now is that eventually this is going to go into the House. But if we look here, we can sort of see how Jackson does. And we look at these totals over here in these pie charts. The top clearly is electoral and the bottom is popular votes. So Adams wins the Northeast, which makes sense because he's from Massachusetts. Jackson wins a lot of the South. He does not win Georgia because that's Crawford State, but the other one, he does not win Virginia. and then you could sort of see Henry Clay out here winning the West. So this is what happens, and so the results are inconclusive. So since they don't receive a majority, which of course was 132, we have to remember that it goes into the House of Representatives. So when it goes into the House of Representatives, here is the little wild card here, and that would be the Speaker of the House is none other than a candidate that was for president this time around. That, of course, is Henry Clay. And so Henry Clay, though, was fourth. Crawford was third. Adams is second. And Jackson was first in the number. So what happens here is that Henry Clay supposedly used his influence as Speaker of the House to help none other than John Quincy Adams win the presidency in the very first ballot in the House of Representatives. So remember, when it goes into the House and the Electoral College cannot determine a winner because no one gets a majority, each state has just one vote, and it becomes a simple majority vote in the House. So if we look, this is the way the states voted at the time. So a big, huge state like Pennsylvania was equal to the importance as a tiny state like Rhode Island or Vermont. Those states all were equal. And so you could sort of see that he got 13, because at the time, you add this up, there were 24 states, one more than half would be 13. And so John Quincy Adams wins it in the House. So now when this comes out that Adams has won, what happens next is Henry Clay is named Adams' Secretary of State. And so Jackson supporters refer to this as a corrupt bargain, that somehow Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams had worked together to somehow have Clay help Adams win in return for a position in the Adams administration. That was the deal that Jackson followers described as corrupt. So the position that Clay wants was Secretary of State. And so kids always ask, what's the big deal? Well, take a look here, and we'll just go through these fast. The very first Secretary of State would be Thomas Jefferson, who becomes the third President of the United States. If we then say, okay, who was Jefferson's third Secretary of State? We would say it's James Madison, who goes on to become the next President of the United States. So if we take good old James Madison and say, who do you think his Secretary of State was? It's none other than James Monroe, the fifth President of the United States. Monroe's Secretary of State was none other than James Monroe, and so we go on to the last one. And Monroe's Secretary of State is John Quincy Adams, the current president at the time. So the reason why it was so important is it was considered a stepping stone to the presidency in the early 1800s. Adams does win and becomes our sixth president. But what happens is the after effects is that basically Adams does not get a lot done because enemies of the president pretty much stop any kind of attempts at any change. And Jackson promises to come back in 1828 and win what he felt was taken away from him in the corrupt bargain of 1824. So we're just going to go through these quick. So in the 1820 election, you currently have obviously John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, and the parties that they represent are the National Republicans now. Okay, they're starting to change their names a little bit, and the Democratic Republicans. And if you look at your own slide, you can sort of see that this is a landslide election towards Andrew Jackson. Okay. So there are several changes that happen during the election process that allows more people to get involved in voting. So let's go to this. So basically, the downside is you have mudslinging at the time. We talked in class about this. This was we'll call it the Coffin Bill, which was directed against General Jackson and some of his actions while he was a general during the War of 1812 and actually had to execute some of his own men. So they thought of him as a murderer. You also had the inclusion of barbecues and rallies, trying to get people out to hear a candidate. buttons and pins and slogans and things like that. So I shared with you these different images of different pins and ways of promoting your candidate. Okay. So then eventually you have slogans of today. What happens next for good old John Quincy Adams is that he actually does something that no one else had ever done, and that is, after his presidency, he goes back and serves in the House of Representatives until his death. He literally died in the House chamber. So in 1831, he gets reelected to Congress and serves in the House of Representatives until 1848, when he dies at his desk here in the old House chamber. Today it is Statuary Hall, but back then this is where the House of Representatives met. They even, this is of course the new area, they even mark his spot there in the area with a marker because it's location of the whisper spot. You'd have to look that up. We talked about that in class. So that's where we'll end this, and we'll pick up with the next 11.1 part 2.